welcome everybody once again to Gallery Teachers Masterclass. David, thank you very much for agreeing to be the panelist on my session.
Thanks for having me.
It's a great pleasure. As we were watching the input session that I recorded some time ago, I was very busy following what was happening in the chat box and writing the comments myself, as were you, David. But I was also jotting down sort of the main or key issues which came up either during the in the input session or in the mostly actually in the chat box, in the discussion in the chat box. And I think the first key issue which came up in a very strong way is the issue of change in education and whether assessment can actually be a positive force in education. And I can see, David, that you're nodding your head. Do you want to say something about this?
No, honestly, it was just that when you asked that question at the beginning, I was like, this is huge. This is such an important discussion, and I'm just so happy that we're having it and that the more and more people, I think, in the industry are having it. And for me, I've recently been doing I work for EC, and I've been doing a lot of focus groups with our teachers and our academic managers and our students, and just sort of listening to the narrative around assessment. And when I ask about assessment, and at this point, I'm just trying to gather information, everybody feels like it is, I said, this barrier, this obstacle, this gateway, and it's not informing them. And I think there's just so much work to be done just across the industry, but really helping students to see and helping teachers to see that assessment is not just a single test, it's everything we do all day long. And for me, like you mentioned reviewing, but it's all like repetition for me is just so important. So, you know, we assess how well a student's done something, we give them feedback, they give each other feedback, they give themselves feedback, and then they do it better, they upgrade it, and they walk away knowing how and why. But lots to be done.
I think this is something that Gabby has just written in the chat box, and I think somebody mentioned that earlier as well in the chat box. Assessment has got very negative connotations. And it's true for both the students and the teachers. And I think one of the reasons, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but one of the reasons is our experience from mainstream education and standardized testing, where the approach to assessment is, let's check what the students cannot do. Let's check what they can't, what knowledge they don't have, what skills they don't have. So it's like catching them out. So of course, students are going to have negative connotations with the word assessment, and for teachers, it has negative connotations also for a number of different reasons. And one of them is that they know that students don't like assessment, so they don't want to give it to students because they don't want negative reactions. And very often teachers don't have the tools to use assessment as something to inform them in how they construct the teaching, how they construct their courses, how they construct their lessons, how they construct the whole process. And I think one of the things that I was saying at one point in the input session was that assessment for learning has got this fantastic potential, not only on a practical level as something that helps us inform our teaching and make students better learners, but it also has the potential to change the image of education. And education these days, unfortunately, doesn't have very good PR. It doesn't have a very good image, and for very good reasons as well.
Hedwig made an interesting thing there, which I think that kind of sums it up. It's, some may think assessment for learning equals testing, and I'd really, we in my institution, we purposely, our the words we use is the progress assessment. It's never a progress test, always a progress assessment. But I know that does anyone who's on the receiving end of that progress assessment know that that's our idea, our motivation behind it, or do they just think it's synonymous, it's another word? And I think that may be one of the issues.
I think that's a very good point. And I think that kind of goes back to the discussion that we also had in the chat box about it was specifically to do with aims and, you know, whether we actually only display aims like on the board or on the notice board or in the online system, or do we actually discuss this with students? And I think it's extremely important to make sure that you know, as a teacher, you know what connotations your students have with the word or with the concept of assessment, what it is that they understand assessment to be, and then talk to them about how you see assessment and what, in your opinion, or in your professional opinion, what assessment can do for the students and for the teachers as well. So I think that discussion is extremely, extremely important. And I think that also this is connected with this whole shift in education from the student being the passive receiver to the student or the learner being an active participant in the process. And by active, I mean understanding what's going on, but also shaping the process together with the teacher.
There's real fear for that.
Yeah, I think, there is. Why do you think that is?
I honestly, this is one I go back and forth on all the time, you know, just really trying to figure out, like, if I find the answer to it, then I can help to change minds or whatever. But I think there is just still in education this idea that, I think someone mentioned earlier in it, that they're the font of all knowledge, that they must be up there. And I think sometimes it's almost, I know, me immediately post CELTA teaching, for me it was imposter syndrome. I knew what I didn't know. Well, I barely touched the iceberg, but I kind of had this, if I'm not up here pontificating, I'm going to be found out and they're going to ask me questions I don't have the answer to. And then gradually over time, that just builds into, this is how you teach. You must be the deliverer of information as opposed to maybe a facilitator of learning. So I think,
but I think it's also one thing is being this fountain of knowledge and the provider of knowledge, but I think also to a certain extent this is about having control over what happens in the classroom. If you as a teacher are the person who decides about everything in the classroom and in the teaching process and in the course, and then you have control. And so you feel more in control, which obviously is a good feeling. You know, we want to be in control of whatever is happening, but I think you can still be in control of the process, and at the same time, you know, encourage other people to be part of that, to be active partners in the whole process as well.
Hard to
and
give
it
it
doesn't
up,
mean that it doesn't mean that you lose control. You just have a different type of control. You still are the specialist, but the learners or the students are the specialists in how they learn and what it is that they want to learn and need to learn. So you actually have, in the classroom, you actually have a meeting of two specialists, the teacher with the specialist knowledge and the learner with the knowledge about what it is that they need or want to learn and how they learn, or how they learn best, or how they want to learn. Now that obviously raises a question of, you know, that there's a lot of students who are not used to being active participants in the process. And that again goes back to the kind of education that they received, the kind of schooling basically that they have received. It's a cultural issue to a large extent as well. You know, participation in education is not accepted everywhere. I mean, participation on the part of the students is not an accepted thing everywhere. So So it is to a large extent, to a certain extent, is also a cultural issue.
So you mentioned there, like, obviously, like, so students can be resistant to it, but and that, you know, you have to, giving up control a little bit isn't a bad thing. You're still in control. I think that's wonderful. I can imagine, you know, everyone sitting there going, yes, 100%, that's great, but it's still scary. So how does a teacher go from like A to B? How do they get from the point where they feel like I have to control everything with input to I want to, you know, bring the students in and make informed decisions?
Well, yeah, I mean, if I had an answer to that question, then I would be the most sought after teacher trainer in the whole world, I think. So, you know, I think it's a process, and sometimes it can be a long process, and it really needs introspection. It needs, on the part of the teacher, it needs, but teachers need guidance in that process of introspection, just as students need guidance in their process of introspection. Yeah? Can I just pick up on something that that just came up in the chat box? Hold on, let me just scroll down to that. Laura says, usually I make it clear that the assessment is not of them, of students as a person, but of the result of their work. And then I first to highlight the good thing emerging from the same work, and what needs to be perfected, what needs to be worked on. Laura, thank you very much for this comment. This is a very, very important point. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about in one of my sessions, one of my previous sessions on feedback, on effective and constructive feedback. Yeah, we don't assess people. We look at what they do, and we look at how we can help them to make progress faster, better, more efficiently, and how we can help them help themselves. So yeah, it's not about assessing them as people. And unfortunately, you know, I have done a lot of observations of teaching activity in different parts of the world, and you know, I have seen some absolutely fantastic teaching, but I have also seen teaching where teachers were not assessing, they were not assessing the work of the students, but they were making comments about the students. And obviously, this is just not something that we do, because it's not about them as people, it's about the work that they do. So it's about their behavior. So,
yeah, I think it's a tricky one, isn't it? Definitely it has to be about the work, but then you get, I've had a lot of resistance when doing sort of teacher training, people saying, well, I don't want to put anyone on the spot. It's this idea of not putting people on the spot, but then you talk to any student in the entire world and all they want is feedback on how well they're doing, so that they can do it better. Like I think there sometimes can be a bit of a sort of disconnect between those two ideas.
I think this idea of putting students on the spot, it's I think it kind of goes back to this idea that when you give students feedback, you talk about you know the infamous sandwich approach. Yeah? You talk a little bit about what was good, and then you hide the that was not so good in the middle, and then you end saying, oh, and by the way, it was a good lesson, or it was a good exercise, or you know, you did well in this activity. And I think it's this way of looking at feedback as providing good and bad information. And I just don't believe that feedback is providing good and bad information. Feedback is about providing information on what was good in a student's performance, and what it is that they need to do to progress faster, better, in order to reach the goal, in order to reach, in order to you know, I think we go back to the success criteria here. If the students know what success looks like, then your feedback is about, okay, here, this is good, okay?
Yeah. So
here you're actually meeting the success criteria. But here you still need to do a little bit of this or that in order to reach the success criteria.
Yeah. And then that's allows them to do it themselves. And suddenly you have a situation, you know, like if you're going to observe a teacher, the teacher should be aware going in of what, you know, the criteria for success is.
Yeah.
And in the post observation chat, your first question will always be, you know, how did you feel it went, and encouraging them to reflect. And a lot of the time they will answer their own question or your questions about what they've done well, what they need to continue working on, and maybe discuss. But it's exactly the same for students. If they know, as you say, what the criteria are, they know what success looks like, they can self-assess, and maybe feedback is a discussion as opposed to
exactly.
a monologue.
It's a conversation.
Yeah,
it's a conversation. It's again, we're moving away from this idea that the teacher knows best and the teacher will tell you because the teacher knows best. Okay,
yeah.
It is a conversation, because your perspective as a teacher is different from the perspective of the student, and sometimes the student knows something about their own goals or their own way of learning, etc., that you don't know.
Yeah.
So you can actually learn as a teacher, you can actually learn from a feedback conversation, and that will help you to help that student better in the future.
Yeah.
Can I just there's two interesting comments that have come up again. Laura says, of course, focus on what is already good, let students save some energy. That's true. Yeah, I think it's important to talk about what's good. You know, we generally, as humanity, we have a tendency to focus on what was not good. Yeah, and we don't necessarily hear enough as people. We don't hear enough about what we did well. So I think it's always a good idea about to talk about what was good, but also objectively, you know, how will you be able to assess your own work if you don't know what you're doing well in other types of tasks? So it's actually quite important, not only on the psychological level, but also on the level of gaining the tools to assess your own work better in the future. That was one point. And then Gabby also said, back to David's question about how we go from being paranoid about control and giving students more say in their own learning. I think it's also about the teacher's confidence, wouldn't you say? Yeah, I would say this is about teacher's confidence.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing though, because confidence can so often be lacking in those early days. It's a difficult thing to stand in front of strangers and teach when you've had, maybe, depending on what your background's been, maybe just a 4-week course. You know, that can be really tricky. And I think we like I said, we kind of get stuck into this control spiral. And one of the things that we do need, you know, support of, be they managers, be they, you know, peers, co-teachers, whatever it is, to encourage. One of the things I've always done is, you get a portion of your class, maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, you are not allowed to plan it. You can go in with maybe a couple of questions related to the topic, but there's no other planning. You have to react and discuss and talk about it with the students. And then gradually, then they realize they can give over control and they don't have to. But yes, of course, it's confidence, and that has to come with time.
Yeah, absolutely. Gabby has thrown in another one for you, David. Assessment for learning is so closely linked to overt teaching.
Yeah, I mean, I really feel like it's two sides of the same coin, really. Just you know, overt teaching for me is it's talking about what we do. It's this, you know, dialogue over monologue, and assessment for learning is exactly the same, isn't it? And I love what you said there, Ania, about you mentioned a minute ago, being objective. And, you know, assessment for learning, this has to be objective. We are creating a situation in the class where objective feedback can be given about peers, from teacher to students. You give it to ourselves, but it doesn't become about the person, like Laura said. It becomes about what they've done. And so often I've seen teachers at the beginning of this, you know, the beginning of their kind of journey into assessment for learning, overt teaching, whatever you call it, and trying to involve students and asking them to give their peers feedback and to assess them, and it just become quite subjective. You know, I spoke to a student the other day who said, another student in the class told me my accent was not good, and I just, my heart broke. God. Like, it was just awful. But yeah, by giving them these tools, by building the framework, then you can allow it, but you can't just jump in afterwards.
Valentina made a very interesting comment. She says, I'm a good organizer, yet my best lessons are the ones I've improvised. Yeah. I mean, improvisation in teaching, it's always based on what sort of knowledge, and I mean language knowledge, and also methodology skills that you have. It's always based on what you know anyway. So it's not improvisation about just about anything. Yeah. So it's just a moment when you become when you feel that you're not necessarily bound by what the course book says, or what you have to do in the lesson. So yeah, I agree. Some of my best lessons have been improvisations as well. I mean, I am a planner. I plan things, but I think the more you plan and the more thorough your planning is, the better you are prepared to improvise. So if you really know what it is that you want to achieve in a lesson, or in a series of lessons, then it's actually easier to kind of go away from the plan, and react with much more confidence to what happens in the classroom and to what your students need at this particular moment. And it doesn't necessarily mean going completely off tangent and talking about something completely different just because somebody asked a question about something. So it is actually, yes, it's improvisation, but it's actually a very conscious process of selecting. I always say that a teacher's brain is like the highest class computer. There's as you talk to your students, there's a lot of computing going on in your head. And you have to make decisions all the time. And that's why teaching is such a difficult profession, because you have to keep making decisions which are based on your knowledge, but also on what's happening in a given moment, and on what you know about your students. So there's a lot of information that goes into it, so that you can actually produce the right output, meaning the right decisions, or the right actions in the classroom. So yeah,
I really think with planning, it's so a lot of the time when people think about planning, and you see this when they're doing like a formal observation or a full observation or something like that, they make decisions they would never make in class. They plan minute to minute input, and they'd never do that as a normal teacher because you observe them. And I think one of the things, I mean, I've always said, one of my little taglines is plan less, teach more. And I don't mean don't plan, but I mean like plan those discussions into your lesson. Planning doesn't mean input. It means planning reflection time, planning discussion of success criteria. That's part of your lesson and part of your plan. But I think sometimes we think too much about input when it comes to planning.
Yeah, I think, but this is also something which is connected with another key point that has come up, and which we have already touched on, and that's the dialogue and monologue idea, or dialogue versus monologue idea, and the role of the teacher and the role of the learner. We traditionally associate teaching, or the teaching profession, with providing input, but teaching is not just about providing input. It's about providing space and time for learning. And I think that's the main job that a teacher has, to give students an opportunity to learn. We all know that you may be teaching, I don't know what, and at the end of the day or at the end of the lesson, students haven't actually learned anything. Or they have learned something completely different from what you were teaching. So teaching does not equal learning. And to ensure that students have a chance to learn, I mean, you can't learn for them, they have to do the learning themselves, but you can provide opportunities for learning. And in order to provide those opportunities, we really need to kind of make this mental shift between the teacher being the person to provide input, and the learner being the person kind of sucking in the input, you know, to, and this is again something that I said earlier, to both being active participants in the process. And if both are active participants in the process becomes a lot richer, a lot more effective, but also a lot more interesting for the students and for the teachers. You know, I sometimes, you know, I have seen teachers in action who, you know, teach, I don't know, 5 groups at B1 level, and they basically repeat the same lesson 5 times. And I'm thinking, you know, if I was a teacher for as long as I have been, I'd die of boredom, you know. I die of boredom, and I don't want to be bored in the classroom, you know. So for me, even if I'm teaching exactly the same level from exactly the same materials, every single lesson is going to be different because the people in that group or that individual that I'm teaching is a different individual. So as I said, I think we need to make that shift between shift with regard to the role of the teacher and the role of the learner. And accept that, again, as I said in the input session, students are capable of introspection. You know, if you help them, if you guide them in that process, because they may not be used to doing that, but if you help them, if you guide them in that process, you will be surprised how much they will be able to discover and tell you about their own learning and about their own needs in terms of what it is that they want to learn. So
it's interesting what Gabby said there, but it's important for students to reflect on what they've learned, because teaching knowledge is learning, like you said. I think a lot of the time as teachers, we're happy to do things like reflection when we feel the lesson's gone really well, because it's almost like we want positive reinforcement. But when we feel like teaching hasn't equal learning, we shy away, as in maybe we don't want to reveal to the students that things didn't go as we'd planned, or that they didn't get the present perfect, or whatever it is. Whereas I would say that's exactly the time when we need to do it, because the only result that can come from that, students are aware, they know, the only result is they're going to walk away thinking either they didn't get it because there's an issue with them, or they didn't get it because there's an issue with you. And neither of those will be true necessarily.
Exactly. Exactly. I think it's in a way connected with this idea that, you know, mistakes are bad. We teachers tend to think that if we do something that maybe didn't work, that's bad. Well, it's not bad, because it's only bad if you don't learn from it. And so I think when something doesn't go the way you want it to go, or if something is not as effective as you were thinking it would be or hoping it would be, that's when you need to look at it, so that you don't actually repeat the same thing again and again not get the result that you're hoping for, you know.
Very often it reveals that it did go better than you thought it would. Like the number of times I've gone, that was a disaster. Talk to the students, they're like, no, we love that. Our faces were just serious because we were thinking. You can never know what's going on in their heads unless you talk to them about it.
Valentina says the only serious mistake is the one we learn nothing from. Thank you very much for that, Valentina. That's a very, very good comment. I think the what we've just been talking about, you know, this whole area by getting students to reflect not only on their learning, but also on the effectiveness of the lesson that they've just taken part in, you know. And it's, of course, it's good for us as teachers to know what works for our students and why something maybe didn't work the way we were hoping for. But it's also very useful and beneficial for the learners, because in the process, they learn to communicate much more openly with the teacher, and that's always good for the learning teaching process. And they also learn about what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And that helps them become, again, more effective learners in the long run. learning is a skill. You know, you need, sometimes you don't, sometimes the school that you've been to, and I'm talking about mainstream education, hasn't actually equipped you with this tool, with these skills. So we need to make sure that we actually give students that tool. And as I said, the reason for this is because it's good for the students and it's good for us, you know. And if we want both the teacher and the student to be active participants in the process, then whatever happens in the classroom, I was actually going to say whatever we do in the classroom, no, whatever happens in the classroom needs to be a positive experience, and needs to build and lead to better learning. Hedy, you said reflection can go well beyond the classroom. Do you want to say something about that?
I mean, it's what I mean by that is that, I mean, you know, there are ups and downs in our lives as well. And if we just, you know, could take this approach that, okay, so it's not a mistake what's happening to me in my life, this is what it is. And so I am in point A, I want to get to B. So what's in between? So how can I get there? What can I do to get there? So this kind of thinking, this approach just puts it in a whole different perspective. And so we would have less people with anxiety and depression and with life crisis, whatever, because it's just, you know, just look at it from a different perspective, whatever is happening to you, and be solution oriented as opposed to beating the drum of, oh, what I did wrong.
Yeah.
It's a real emotional maturity that comes from being an effective learner, isn't there? Yeah. I think we're equipping them for skills, you know, with skills they can use in work, in life, in relationships. And
exactly.
Which is really important.
One of the things that sort of keeps coming up in discussions that I have with people, and I have also recently given a talk about the future of education. And one of the things that, I mean, if you look at research, you see that that soft skills are becoming more and more important. And we all know that soft skills are extremely important in the workplace, but they're becoming more and more important in education as well. And this is something that as English teachers, we will actually be dealing with more and more. And there's a very good practical reason for that as well. And that is that our students are very likely to work either in international teams or in international companies in a different country from the country where they were born. And they'll need to perform those soft skills, not only in their native language or the first language, but also in the language that they are learning. And in our case, obviously, it's English. And so this is something that we will be spending more and more time doing in the English language classroom as well. And I think that can only bring benefits. I mean, I really seriously don't see any negative sides of focusing on soft skills in the English language classroom. Valentina says, oh, this one is for you, David. Finally, an off topic. It always does me good to hear an Irish accent, David.
Exactly, that's what it's all about. You can say anything you want as long as it's an Irish accent. It's all right.
Yeah. But Laura says we affect their future life with our attitude. Absolutely. Okay, Gabby has asked a question: in what ways can the teachers share learning aims with students? Ania, do you mind saying something about this reflective question, please? I know you have mentioned it in the video, but I think this is such an important question. Okay, so in what ways can the teachers share learning aims with students? And this, again, this kind of touches on the discussions that we've already had a little bit in the chat box and a little bit here, about the fact that there's a difference between displaying aims and discussing aims with students. Yeah? What I'm sure you have seen in some context, David, as well, is that aims for a lesson, a week, a month or whole course are displayed on the board, for example, or notice board, which is all handed out to students on a photocopy or sent by email as a PDF, for example, which is always a very good idea. But showing the aims does not mean that students will, first of all, read it. And secondly, if they read it, it doesn't mean that they will understand everything that we write about in this document. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with this. Yeah. So, and again, if we're talking about the teacher and the student being active participants in the process, I think it's a good idea to see if students are actually in agreement in terms of the things that we want to do with them in the classroom. So there's a number of different ways in which you can do it, but obviously it's a good idea if you have, whether it's a document which you send by email or a document which you post on the notice board, physical or online, it's obviously a good idea to give students time to digest it and then to talk about it, to discuss it, to see and make sure, first of all, that they know when they get this document that this is that this is not set in stone, that this is a document which can be adapted if the discussion shows that this is what we need to do. The discussion about this can be done in many, many different ways. It can be done as a class discussion. It can be done as discussion in small groups where the teacher moderates. It can be done even as a pyramid discussion. There's, technically there's a lot of different ways in which you can do it. The important thing is that you not only display but also discuss. David, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a huge area, and just the words aim and objective. There's so many different ways you can define them, and I think one of the issues is we have a bit of a discrepancy maybe in the industry between something like a high-level curriculum or course aim and a in-class student-friendly aim that is relevant for them. And very often what we end up doing is displaying or sending, as you said, something that's quite high level, maybe it's CEF4 related, means absolutely nothing to a student, to a learner. They just can't really break it down, even to a teacher sometimes. These are like curriculum kind of aims. And I think what we first need to do is make sure our aims are effective in that they are worded in a way that is meaningful and relevant to the students. And then we can discuss them, and it's much more. But if you say, if you start talking about mediation, which is a big thing in the CEF4, what does that mean to a student? But being able to read a language in our text in your language and talk to someone and summarize it in a second language, that's meaningful and works for a student. So I think that's our first step. And then the second thing is something that came up there in the chat windows. It was Gabby, how much flexibility, right? And for me, so I define an objective as where we're going with the lesson, the final communicative outcome of the lesson. The aims as the kind of steps we're going to do to get to that and achieve that objective. For me, the aims are entirely flexible and negotiable because each student is maybe going to need to get there in slightly different levels or slightly different ways. But the objective should be more or less, I want to say set in stone, but set. That's your kind of, so be it to have, to be able to keep up with an animated discussion or something like that. But the way we get there might be, one person needs speaking skills to learn to interrupt. Another person needs to be able to monitor intonation to know when the end of a sentence in the beginning. Another person needs to be able to know connected chunks because they're in an environment. That's, I think, negotiable, but we should all be going to the same place. How we get there might be different.
Yeah, I agree. I think it also depends on what kind of course you're teaching, and whether you're teaching a group of students or an individual student. With individual students, what I find, for example, is that very often objectives change because their work situation changes, the the needs in terms of English change, and so the objectives need to change as well. There's a question in the Q&A box from Laura, who says, how can I be in touch with other attendees to go on sharing experiences and ask for suggestions? Laura, there's a forum that goes with every Gallery Teachers Masterclass workshop. And so this is the place where you can actually get in touch with other attendees and share experiences, ask for suggestions. So that would be my answer to that question. Okay, is there anything else that you would like to mention, David?
Just the final thing, that kind of just while we're talking about aims and objectives and how to discuss, was it the whole this idea of where we are, where we're going, and how we need to get there. I think it's such a beautiful way of looking at it, such a beautiful kind of easy framework for teachers to apply to discussing aims and objectives. So just want to bring that up, which is a really nice nice approach. Yeah, thanks a lot for that, David. That was it's, you know, when I think about goals, when, you know, the different organizations use different words. So yeah, as you said, for you, objectives are the sort of the higher level, and the aims are the under the objective, so to speak. But when we talk about this, for me, it's a little bit, because learning is a journey. And, you know, when you think about a navigation system, you know where you're going, okay? But the navigation system using a navigation system does not mean that it's a straight line. Sometimes, because of the traffic on the way, the navigation system will actually tell you to go a slightly different route, but you still get to where you are planning to get, hopefully anyway. I think it's probably time to finish the discussion slowly. Thank you very much for your very kind words. Thank you. Thanks a lot, everybody, for a very nice, for all the very nice comments and a very interesting discussion.